You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent, my son said across the dinner table, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. His wife didn't even look up, just kept slicing her chicken as if nothing cruel had been spoken. The room went still, except for the soft clink of her knife against the plate. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I simply placed my fork down, folded my napkin, and breathed in slowly. "Is that so?" I said, almost in a whisper. And then I smiled. The smile wasn't because I found anything amusing. It was a shield, a quiet curtain I'd learned to pull down over my heart whenever life decided to bruise it. After all, this wasn't the first time grief had walked into my home and sat at my table uninvited. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far my words can travel. The dining room felt heavier than usual that evening. The chandelier cast a warm glow over the oak table my husband built 40 years ago. Every scratch on its surface had a memory attached. Birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, nights spent helping our son with homework. Now that same table held a different kind of weight. My son leaned back in his chair, avoiding my eyes. His shoulders stiffened the way they used to when he was a boy caught doing something wrong. Except this time, he wasn't a child. And this time, the wrongdoing was deliberate. I studied him quietly. The once soft boy who used to run into my arms now spoke to me like a stranger, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to say those words. His wife glanced over at me then, just briefly. Her expression didn't hold sympathy or guilt. If anything, it held relief. As if this moment had been a long-awaited victory, I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap. I would not tremble in front of them. "Dinner's lovely," she said, breaking the silence. I nodded. "I'm glad you think so." Behind my calm voice, a memory flickered, the sound of my husband's laughter echoing in this very room. The man who promised he'd take care of me until his last breath. And he had. Or so I believed. Losing him had already hollowed out pieces of me I didn't know could break. Now, hearing our talk about selling the company his father poured his entire life into, it felt like watching someone burn down a house while you're still standing inside it. But grief had taught me something valuable. Rushing into the flames doesn't put out the fire. So I stayed quiet, collected, still. My son glanced at me again, maybe expecting tears, shouting, or pleading. He didn't get any of that. Instead, he got a smile that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't prepared for my silence. Silence, after all, is the one thing people can't predict. I reached for my water glass, steady as ever. "Well," I said softly, "thank you for telling me." That was all. Inside, the ache was sharp, but I refused to let it spill into the room. Not tonight, not in front of them, because nothing stirs fear in the hearts of the unkind, quite like the quiet of someone they expected to break. And in that moment, even as my world tilted, I made a private promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. Not by far. The house felt different when I stepped inside that night, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I hung my coat on the same hook I'd used for decades, listening to the faint creak it made. An old sound, familiar, steady. Everything else in my life seemed to be shifting beneath my feet, but that little sound stayed the same. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the light. The glow revealed what grief had already begun. Dishes I hadn't put away, a stack of unopened mail, a thin layer of dust gathering on the counter where my husband used to make his morning coffee. He'd been gone for only a year, but sometimes it felt like 10. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet wrap around me. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has moved on without you. After losing him, the house had started shrinking, not in size, but in presence. Every room that once held laughter now held shadows. Even the sunlight through the kitchen window felt weaker, as if it didn't know where to fall without him there. I opened the fridge, stared at the leftover casserole from earlier. I wasn't hungry. Grief has a way of numbing everything, even appetite. I closed the fridge again and leaned on the counter, catching my reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. A 68-year-old woman stared back, silver hair pulled neatly behind her ears, shoulders squared despite the weight she carried. My son used to call me every day after his father passed. At first, he'd come by just to sit with me, to fix things around the house that didn't even need fixing. But gradually the visits grew shorter, then sporadic, then convenient only when his wife decided they should check in. The warmth faded so quietly I almost didn't notice. Almost. I walked into the living room, brushing my fingers along the frame of the photograph on the mantel, our family Christmas from years ago. My husband in his favorite sweater, my son leaning against him, laughing, the three of us close enough to look like a single shape in the picture. I remembered the night that photo was taken. My husband had nudged me and whispered, "We did good, didn't we?" And I had believed him. I still want to believe him. But tonight, the edges of that memory felt sharper. I lowered the frame and sat on the couch. The cushion dipped beneath my weight, sighing the way old cushions do. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had at the dinner table earlier, the same way I always did when I needed to keep myself from shaking. Grief had already taken so much. My partner, my routine, the life I thought I'd continue living. But now, my own child had looked me in the eye and told me I was a burden. A burden. He had no idea how many nights I stayed awake by his crib, praying his fever would break. How many shifts I picked up when money was tight so he could have new shoes for school. How many times his father and I skipped vacations, skipped plans, skipped sleep because raising him mattered more. But I didn't let myself linger there. Not tonight. Instead, I sat quietly, breathing through the ache, letting the silence settle again. There would be time to think later, time to understand why he said what he did, time to decide what to do with the truth he'd thrown at me. For now, I just sat in my home, the same home I built with love, and let the weight of this new loneliness press into me. I wasn't broken, just rearranged. Morning came quietly, slipping through the blinds in thin pale lines that stretched across the bedroom floor. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before standing, letting my feet find the soft rug my husband bought years ago. He'd insisted on it because he said cold floors were unkind to aging bones. I used to tease him for saying that. Now I understood. The house was still. No humming appliances, no footsteps, no voice calling my name from down the hall. Just the hollow sound of my own breathing in a place that used to feel full. I moved through the motions of mourning, turning on the coffee maker, rinsing the mug that had been sitting in the sink, setting it down on the counter. I didn't brew coffee. I just needed the rhythm of routine, even if I didn't follow it through. Sometimes routine was the only thing that kept the loneliness from spilling over. I glanced at the table where a stack of bills lay open but unpaid. Property taxes, utilities, medical insurance. I wasn't behind yet, but the numbers pressed harder now that I knew my son had taken away the one thing his father left to secure my future. I touched the edge of the envelope. My fingers didn't shake, but my chest tightened. He had sold the company. Just sold it. And he had said it in the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. No regret. No hesitation. My husband spent 40 years building that business. Years of late nights, long drives, and calloused hands. I stood beside him through all of it. And now it was gone, with one careless announcement over dinner. I walked into the living room, letting my hand trail across the back of the couch. Dust motes floated in the light, rising and falling like tiny ghosts. I thought of my son again, how he wouldn't meet my eyes, how quickly he looked to his wife after speaking those words, how she smirked as if she had already won something I didn't know I was competing for. That small smirk stayed with me more than the words. I sank slowly into the armchair near the window, the same place I used to sit while waiting for my husband to come home. Outside, the street was quiet. A jogger passed with a dog tugging at the leash. A delivery truck rattled by. Life continued on, unaware of the small collapse happening inside this house. I folded my hands together and rested them in my lap, a familiar gesture by now. My son had changed gradually over the years, pushed along by ambition, nudged by a marriage that seemed to take more than it gave. I remembered the way he used to call, excited to share good news. I remembered how he'd sit across from me and talk about expanding the company, modernizing it, making his father proud. And I remembered watching that excitement fade into something harder, something colder. People rarely transform overnight. They just drift inch by inch until one day you look at them and realize you don't recognize them anymore. A gust of wind shook the branches outside. I watched a leaf detach and spiral to the ground. For a moment, I felt like that leaf, quiet, small, and carried away by forces I couldn't stop. But as I sat there, the silence shifted, not warmer, not kinder, just clearer. His words replayed in my mind, not as a wound now, but as a realization. If I was truly the burden he believed, then he had never really known me at all. I straightened slightly in the chair, smoothing the front of my sweater. I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was simply awake. And sometimes that is where everything begins. That afternoon, I stepped into the small room my husband once used as his office. The door gave its familiar soft groan, the same sound it made every evening when he'd come in here to sort paperwork or answer calls. I hadn't entered this room much since he passed. It felt like crossing into a place where time hadn't caught up yet. Dust lay across his old desk in a thin, respectful layer. The lamp on the corner still had the same warm-toned bulb he preferred. A stack of folders remained neatly aligned, untouched since the day he stopped needing them. I ran my fingers along their edges, each one a silent reminder of the life we built side by side. I opened one drawer, then another. Receipts, notes in his handwriting, clipped documents he'd been reviewing. Everything was exactly where he left it. Everything except him. I sat down slowly in his chair, the leather sighed beneath me, shaped by years of his weight, not mine. My hands rested on the armrests, and for a moment, it felt like I was borrowing a space that still remembered someone else better. I let the room settle around me as memories rose, quiet ones, gentle ones. The evenings when he'd call me in just to ask my opinion on contracts. The mornings when he'd kiss my forehead before leaving early. The way he'd talk about the company as though it were a living thing, something he was raising carefully year by year. He loved that company. He cared for it the way some people care for gardens or old houses, with patience, with pride, with stubborn dedication. And he always said it would take care of me one day, long after he no longer could. My son knew that. He knew it better than anyone. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that realization settle inside me. The betrayal wasn't just the sale. It was the choice. The decision to erase decades of his father's work, our work, with one signature. I opened my eyes again and pulled a folder closer. Inside were older documents, the kind my husband kept even when they weren't needed anymore. Contracts from the early years, notes from expansions, a letter he wrote to the board when he stepped down. His handwriting filled the margins, small, neat, steady. One page caught my eye. A note he'd written at the bottom of a meeting agenda. Protect her interests. Non-negotiable. I touched the ink lightly. It felt like touching his voice. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking seconds I barely noticed passing. The house didn't feel empty now. It felt watchful, as though the past were waiting for me to understand something it had been trying to tell me for a long time. I leaned back, letting the chair hold me. Not everything made sense yet. Not every question had an answer, but the fog around my thoughts was beginning to clear. My son's words, my husband's notes, the silence from both ends of my life speaking in ways neither could anymore. People drift, loyalties shift, but truth stays where it is, patient and stubborn, until someone finally looks it in the face. I stood up and smoothed the front of my blouse, feeling the faintest stir of something I hadn't felt since he passed. Not strength, not confidence, something quieter, something steadier, a beginning. I closed the drawer gently, almost ceremonially, and stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I wasn't done grieving, I wasn't done hurting. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't standing still. 2 days passed quietly, each one stretching longer than the last. I kept to my routines, though they felt thinner now, like fabric worn from too many washings. I watered the plants on the porch. I sorted laundry I didn't need to sort. I made tea and let it grow cold on the counter. The kind of tasks you do when your mind is somewhere else entirely. On the third afternoon, as I was sweeping the front walk, a car I recognized turned into the driveway. It was Daniel's, my husband's oldest friend and the accountant who helped manage the company in its early years. He still visited occasionally after my husband passed, always with a box of pastries or a story from the past. Today, he stepped out of the car empty-handed, his expression unusually serious. He walked toward me with a small, hesitant smile. Thought I'd check in on you, he said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. I nodded, leaning the broom against the railing. It's good to see you. He studied me for a long moment, eyes narrowing just slightly, the way people look when they're trying to measure something without asking the question out loud. Then he cleared his throat. Your son came by my office last week, he said carefully. He asked for access to some of the older financial records, said he needed them for restructuring. The word restructuring moved through me like a ripple. I didn't react outwardly, but he noticed something in my stillness. You didn't know, he murmured. I shook my head once. Daniel's shoulders fell. I suspected as much. We moved inside, and I gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table. Sunlight hovered across the wood, catching the fine scratches time had carved into its surface. He rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced as though preparing himself. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, he said. Something your husband asked me to keep quiet unless it ever became necessary. My breath stilled, but I kept my expression soft. Go on. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, aged, sealed, my husband's handwriting on the front. Seeing his familiar script sent a quiet ache through my chest. He made this shortly before he passed, Daniel said. He wanted to make sure you'd be protected, no matter what happened with the company. He slid the envelope toward me. I didn't open it yet. I just let my fingertips rest on the paper, feeling its weight, its intention. Your son, he believes the sale gives him full authority, Daniel continued. But there were provisions your husband added. Safeguards. He wanted everything to remain secure for you. I looked down at the envelope again, then back at Daniel. His eyes held the kind of sorrow reserved for truths delivered too late. You should read it when you're ready, he said gently. I nodded, thanking him. He stood, lingering for a moment as if searching for the right words, then simply said, You weren't meant to face this alone, before heading for the door. When he left, the house fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt fuller, heavier, like something had stepped quietly into the room with me. I held the envelope in both hands, tracing the edges with my thumb. My husband had known. He had prepared. And somewhere inside this paper was the truth he'd left behind, not spoken, but written, waiting for the moment I would need it. I set the envelope down on the table, exhaled slowly, and let the weight of it settle into the room. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And suddenly the quiet didn't feel quite so empty. I waited until evening before opening the envelope. The house had settled into its usual stillness by then, the kind that made the ticking of the hallway clock sound louder than it should. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Daniel had left the envelope earlier that day, and let my fingers gently break the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a letter, my husband's handwriting steady and familiar, as if he had written it yesterday. The second was a legal amendment, stamped, witnessed, dated. I placed the amendment aside for the moment and lifted the letter carefully. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. That first line alone pressed a heaviness against my ribs. I read slowly, letting each word settle. He wrote about his worries, about changes he had noticed in our son, shifts in behavior he hoped were temporary, but feared were not. He mentioned concerns about outside influence, subtle comments he had overheard, conversations cut short when he entered a room. He didn't name anyone, but I didn't need him to. I already knew. He explained that the company was more than a business. It was our future, our security. And he wanted to ensure that no one, not even family, could dismantle what he had built without safeguarding me first. Near the end of the letter, he wrote something that made my eyes pause. People reveal themselves when they believe no one is paying attention. If that time ever comes, I want you to have what you need to stand steady. I folded the letter gently, feeling its weight long after I set it down. Then I reached for the legal document. It was simple, only a few pages, but the meaning behind it was enormous. It granted me full oversight rights, rights that superseded any decisions made without my written approval, rights my son either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore. The amendment was still valid, still lawful, still binding. My husband had protected me even after he was gone. I leaned back in my chair, breathing out slowly. The ache inside me didn't disappear, but it shifted, making room for something steadier, something almost like resolve. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. The truth had been there all along, waiting quietly in an envelope sealed with trust. Outside the kitchen window, the evening sky deepened into a muted blue. A single street lamp flickered to life, its glow stretching across the sidewalk. I watched the light spill into the growing darkness and felt something echo inside me, a small, steady flame where there had only been cold. My son's words replayed in my mind. "You're a burden. I sold Dad's company." He had spoken them with certainty, with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid. But he didn't know about this letter. He didn't know about this amendment. He didn't know his father had seen further than any of us realized. I folded everything back into the envelope, smoothing the flap closed as if sealing a promise. Then I placed it in the desk drawer, beneath a stack of ordinary papers, hidden, but within reach. The house was quiet again, but not hollow. Not tonight. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like something pressing down on me. It felt like something opening. A space. A beginning. A truth ready to be used when the moment arrived. I stood, turned off the kitchen light, and let the darkness settle naturally around me. I wasn't afraid of the quiet anymore. The next morning arrived with a thin gray light that made everything in the house look softer, almost blurred. I moved slowly through the kitchen, my steps quiet on the tile floor. I wasn't rushing. There was no reason to. The letter and the amendment in the drawer had changed something inside me, not loudly but firmly, like a door clicking shut. I poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. As I waited for it to heat, I glanced at the clock. My son usually called around this time, not to check on me, but to ask for something, documents, old records, information he didn't want to look for himself. The past few months had made that pattern clear. But today, the phone stayed silent. I didn't mind. Silence had started to feel like a companion rather than a void. When the kettle whistled, I turned off the heat and made tea, letting the steam rise slowly against my face. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in the armchair near the window, the same spot where I'd rediscovered my own stillness just days earlier. Outside, the street was just beginning to wake up, cars rolling by, a neighbor walking her dog, someone scraping frost from a windshield. Normal life, ordinary life, a life I was beginning to stand inside again. I took a sip of tea and then set the mug down as footsteps approached my porch, light, quick steps, familiar ones. A moment later, there was a knock. Not forceful, not polite, just expected. I opened the door to find my daughter-in-law standing there, wrapped in a coat far too expensive for the weather, her expression tight with impatience. "Good morning," she said, though her tone didn't match the words. "We need to talk." I stepped aside calmly, gesturing for her to enter. She looked around the house with that same assessing gaze she often used, as if she were mentally cataloging everything she thought she deserved. She sat on the couch without waiting to be invited. "Your son is very stressed," she began. "The sale took a lot out of him. He needs support right now." I nodded once, keeping my face neutral. "I see." She frowned at my calmness, as if she expected tears or confusion. "He said you seemed off at dinner, quiet." Her eyes narrowed. "Is there something you want to tell us?" The irony almost made me smile. I took my time crossing to the armchair, lowering myself gently. "No," I said softly. "Nothing at all." Her frustration flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. "Good, because the company transition is complicated, and we can't afford more issues. You understand that, I'm sure." I watched her closely, not confrontational, just observant. The way her hands fidgeted with her purse strap, the way her gaze kept darting toward the hallway, as if expecting to see documents lying around. She didn't know what my husband had left behind. She didn't know how wrong her assumptions were. She leaned forward. "He needs you to cooperate, to stay out of the way while he handles everything. It's better for everyone." I felt the words land, not painfully this time, but predictably, like hearing a song I already knew by heart. I folded my hands in my lap. "I'll keep that in mind." She stared at me, searching for something she couldn't find. Fear, maybe, or compliance. Instead, she found stillness, a kind she didn't recognize. After a long moment, she stood abruptly. "Well, I'm glad we talked." I walked her to the door. She hesitated on the porch, glancing back at me with a tight smile. "Just remember, We're doing what's best for the family. I nodded. Of course. When she left, I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. She thought I was retreating. She thought silence meant surrender. But silence can hold many things. Today, mine held the beginning of something she would never see coming. After she left, the house held its breath again, but it wasn't the same tense, hollow quiet as before. This silence was observant, almost patient, as if it knew something was shifting beneath the surface. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the rest of my tea down the sink. It had gone cold while she lectured me about family decisions. I rinsed the mug, set it upside down on the drying rack, and let my hands linger on the rim. Her words replayed, sharp, practiced, full of entitlement. Stay out of the way. Better for everyone. They were said with the confidence of someone who assumed the ground she stood on belonged to her. But she didn't know the ground had already changed. I wiped my hands on a towel and moved to the hallway where the small drawer held my husband's letter and the amendment. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Just knowing it was there steadied me. It reminded me that I wasn't drifting anymore. I wasn't waiting to be told what my life would be. I was beginning to understand the shape of things. The doorbell rang. Soft, quick. I paused before opening it. This time it was my neighbor, Mrs. Lambert, holding a small container of soup. You've been on my mind, she said gently. Thought you might want something warm today. I thanked her and accepted the container, feeling a different kind of warmth rise in my chest, one that came from simple kindness. She didn't stay long, but her visit anchored me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. After she left, I placed the soup in the fridge and leaned against the counter. Not everyone in my life had drifted away. Not everyone saw me as an inconvenience. The contrast made the betrayal sharper, but it also made the truth clearer. People choose who they reveal themselves to be. I walked into the living room and sat down, letting the afternoon light settle across my lap. I thought about my son, how distant he'd become, how quickly he aligned himself with decisions that didn't belong to him. The change hadn't happened overnight, but the cruelty at dinner, that had felt final. What I couldn't understand yet was why. Why he'd let someone else's ambition replace his father's legacy. Why he'd let someone else's voice drown out his own judgment. Why he looked at me as though I were a burden, rather than the person who had raised him, protected him, believed in him. But questions didn't frighten me anymore. I had lived long enough to know answers reveal themselves when the noise quiets down. And my life had grown very quiet lately. I smoothed the sleeve of my sweater and looked around the room. The framed photographs, the well-worn furniture, the soft indent on the couch where my husband used to sit. Nothing here was loud or dramatic. Everything simply existed, steady and constant, waiting for me to catch up. A soft determination began to form, not with grand plans or sudden anger, but with a simple, steady truth. I didn't owe anyone silence when their intentions were built on deception. I didn't need to confront anyone today. I didn't need to make accusations or demand answers. I just needed to keep moving, one quiet step at a time, toward whatever came next. The letter in the drawer had opened a door. My daughter-in-law's visit had confirmed which direction I needed to walk. And somewhere in the growing calm of my thoughts, a realization settled in. They believed I was standing still. They had no idea I had already started to move. The next morning brought a thin layer of frost across the windows, turning the view outside into a muted watercolor. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug, letting the heat settle into my palms as the house slowly woke around me. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft knock of branches brushing against the siding. I sat at the kitchen table, thinking about the envelope in the drawer. Not with fear, not with urgency, just a steady awareness, like knowing a lantern was nearby even before the room turned dark. I wasn't ready to use it yet, but I knew I would. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside to check the mail. Bills, a grocery flyer, a sympathy card that had arrived months too late. I held the small stack against my chest as I walked back to the house. That was when I saw my son's car turning into the driveway. He parked but didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. When he finally stepped out, he closed the door with more force than necessary. His shoulders were tight, his jaw working back and forth like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say out loud. "Mom," he called out. I waited on the porch, still holding the mail. "Good morning." He nodded but didn't return the smile. We need to clear a few things up." We. It wasn't lost on me that he didn't say I. He climbed the steps and stood a few feet away, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "My wife told me she came by yesterday. She said you were acting different. Different." It was an interesting choice of word. "I was myself," I replied softly. "Nothing more." He rubbed his forehead. "She thinks you're upset about the sale, and honestly, Mom, this isn't the time for you to make things harder." Harder. As if quietly existing in my own home was some kind of obstacle. I lowered the mail onto the small porch table. "Why would I make things harder?" He hesitated. It was only a moment, but it held years' worth of weight. Uncertainty, guilt, conflicting loyalties. Then he repeated something I knew hadn't come from him. "You don't understand how business works anymore. Dad built something good, but it needed change. Selling was the right decision." He said the words with confidence, but his eyes flickered, nerves slipping through. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I didn't reveal the amendment tucked safely in my drawer. Instead, I simply watched him, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to unsettle him. He shifted again. "Mom, you aren't planning anything, right?" That question told me everything. They weren't worried about my feelings. They were worried about losing control. I clasped my hands gently in front of me. "What would I plan?" He swallowed, glancing back at his car. "Just don't interfere, please. Let us handle it." I nodded slowly. "If that's what you believe is best." The relief that washed across his face wasn't comforting. It was illuminating. He exhaled deeply, almost slumping. "Good. I was worried you'd overreact. Overreact. A word used when someone expects you to break. But I didn't break. I simply stepped aside and let him walk back down the porch steps. He paused at the bottom, as if wanting to say more, then chose silence instead, and returned to his car. I watched him drive away, the exhaust drifting in the cold morning air. He believed the conversation had settled things. He believed my calm meant surrender. He believed the silence behind me was the same silence that surrounded me weeks ago. But the house felt different now. The quiet felt different, and I knew, with absolute clarity, he had no idea what I was capable of when I stopped standing still. That afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Heavy clouds rolled in, settling low over the neighborhood like a blanket pulled too tightly across the horizon. I turned on the hallway light as I walked toward the small office where the drawer held the envelope. My husband's voice on paper, his protection sealed in ink. I didn't open it. I just needed to see it, to feel the steady presence of something that belonged to him, not to the chaos my son and his wife had created. I closed the drawer gently and rested my hand on the wood for a moment, grounding myself. Then I picked up the phone. Not to call my son, not to question him, not to plead. I dialed a different number, one I hadn't used since my husband's passing. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mrs. Hart? It's been a while." "Yes," I said softly. "I believe it has." It was our family attorney, the one my husband trusted, the one who handled every important document with a care that felt almost personal. "I'd like to schedule a meeting," I said. "Soon." He didn't ask why. He didn't push. "I can see you tomorrow morning. Thank you." After I hung up, I stood there for a long moment, absorbing the simple truth of what I'd just done. No panic, no rush, just a quiet step forward, guided by my husband's foresight and my own clarity. The house seemed to shift around me again. Not visibly, not audibly, but in the way a room feels different when you finally turn on a light. I walked into the living room, sat in the armchair, and watched the storm clouds gather. Rain tapped lightly on the windows at first, then harder, drumming a steady rhythm across the glass. I listened, letting the sound settle into me. My son believed I was the same woman who stood at that dinner table, holding back tears. My daughter-in-law believed I was someone they could manage, direct, silence. But storms don't announce themselves. They gather quietly until the sky breaks open. The doorbell rang just as the rain picked up. I opened it to find a delivery driver holding a thick envelope, registered mail. "Signature, please." My name was printed across the front in bold letters. I signed, thanked him, and closed the door. The envelope felt heavier than expected. Inside were the official documents confirming the sale of the company, copies my son had been legally required to send me, though clearly he hadn't expected them to arrive so quickly. I sat at the table and spread the papers out, scanning each page slowly. Something was off. Dates that didn't match. Figures that were suspiciously altered. Approvals that should have included my signature but didn't. I didn't need to be an expert to recognize what was missing. My consent. My involvement. My rights. The amendment in the drawer wasn't just a safeguard. It was a boundary they had crossed without even checking if the ground beneath them was solid. I gathered the papers neatly into a stack, aligning their edges with a calm precision that felt almost ceremonial. The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the windows, rain sweeping sideways across the porch. I looked toward the office again. The drawer. The envelope. The quiet truth waiting for daylight. Tomorrow I would take everything, my husband's letter, the amendment, the unsigned approvals, to the attorney. Not to start a fight, not to punish, but to restore what had been broken long before that dinner table conversation. The storm outside rumbled low as if agreeing. I turned off the light and let the house rest around me, steady and unafraid. They thought selling the company ended the story. They had no idea it was only the beginning. The next morning, the air felt crisp, washed clean by the storm that had passed overnight. I dressed quietly, choosing a simple navy sweater and the coat my husband always said made me look put together. I stood for a moment at the mirror, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders. There was no trembling in my hands today. I walked to the office drawer, opened it, and slipped the envelope inside my bag, along with the documents that had arrived the night before. Everything fit neatly, almost too neatly, as if this moment had been waiting for me long before I realized it. The attorney's office was 20 minutes away. I drove with the windows cracked slightly, letting the cold air brush against my face. The world outside looked unchanged. Children waiting for school buses, shops opening, a man jogging with his dog. Ordinary life continued, unaware that mine was shifting with every mile. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile that softened the edges of my nerves. "He'll be right with you," she said. I nodded and took a seat in the waiting area, my hands resting calmly on my bag. I could feel the envelope inside, steady, patient, ready. After a few minutes, the attorney stepped out of his office. His expression was kind, but tinged with concern. "Mrs. Hart," he said, extending a hand. "Come in." I followed him into the office, a room filled with books, framed certificates, and the faint scent of old paper. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. "What can I help you with?" he asked gently. I placed the envelope and documents on his desk. "I need you to look at these," I said. My voice was level, controlled. "All of them." He examined the amendment first. As he read, his brows drew together, then lifted slightly in recognition. "I remember drafting this," he murmured. "Your husband was very clear about his intentions." He set the amendment down and reached for the sale documents next. His eyes scanned each page slowly, methodically. The room felt still, as though the very air were holding itself in place. After a while, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Mrs. Hart," he said carefully, "your signature is missing from every required approval. Legally, any sale conducted without it is invalid." I didn't speak. I simply folded my hands in my lap. He tapped the corner of the amendment. "And this document gives you full oversight power. It means your consent wasn't optional. It was essential." A quiet certainty settled deeper inside me, like a stone placed deliberately where it needed to be. He continued, "Your husband took measures to protect you. Strong measures. You still hold full authority." I nodded once. "What happens next?" "Well," he said, choosing his words thoughtfully, "we can request an immediate freeze on all transactions tied to the sale. And once that's done, your son will need to respond. Legally." He paused. "This won't be a small conversation." "I'm aware." He studied me for a long moment, perhaps expecting fear, anger, or hesitation, but all he found was calm. "You've handled this with remarkable composure," he said quietly. "I've had a lot of practice," I replied. He smiled faintly, then gathered the documents. "I'll begin the process today, but I need you to prepare yourself. When your son learns of this, things may become tense." I looked down at the envelope, at my husband's handwriting still visible along the edge. He made his choice, I said softly. Now I'm making mine. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my car, the winter air sharp against my skin. I sat for a moment before turning the key in the ignition. My son believed I didn't understand what he had done. He believed I was powerless. He believed my silence meant surrender. But today, the law had spoken louder than he ever expected. And I was finally ready to let the truth speak for me. By the time I arrived home, the clouds had parted just enough for a thin line of sunlight to stretch across the porch. It wasn't bright, not warm, but it was enough to guide my steps as I walked inside. I set my bag on the kitchen table, the documents still carefully stacked within it, and let myself breathe for a moment, slow, steady, deliberate. I had spent months drifting through rooms filled with memories, unsure where I belonged in the life unfolding around me. But today, standing in my own kitchen, I felt the ground return beneath my feet. Solid, familiar, mine. The phone rang that afternoon. Once, twice, then again. I didn't answer. Not yet. Eventually, the ringing stopped, replaced by a silence so still it felt like the house itself was listening. A few minutes later, a car pulled into the driveway, my son's. His steps were rushed, heavy, almost frantic as he came up the walkway. Then came the knock, sharp, uneven. "Mom, open the door. Door. We need to talk." I opened it gently. He stood there, breath visible in the cold air, eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. "My lawyer called," he said, voice trembling. "He said the sale is frozen. He said you contested it." I held his gaze, calm as water settling after a storm. "You sold something that wasn't yours," I said softly, "and you knew it." His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, like the boy who used to run to me after scraping his knee, except now the wound was one he had created himself. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" he whispered. "Why go to a lawyer?" "You didn't talk to me," I replied. "You talked at me. You made decisions about my life without asking if I could carry the weight of them." He looked away, jaw tight, shame creeping into the space between us. His wife sat in the car watching, her expression unreadable through the windshield. I stepped aside slightly but didn't invite him in. "Your father tried to protect you," I said, "and he tried to protect me. I won't let either of those promises go to waste." He swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," I said. "The documents will move forward. The truth will come out. But whether you stand with me or against me, that part is still your choice." For a moment, neither of us spoke. A cold wind swept across the porch, stirring a few dry leaves around his feet. "I didn't think you'd fight back," he admitted quietly. "I didn't think I'd have to," I answered. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in realization. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I lost myself. I let things get in my head." I nodded once. "Then find your way back." He lowered his eyes, turned slowly, and walked toward the car. His wife looked straight ahead as he opened the door. They drove away without another word. I remained on the porch as the quiet settled again, this time without heaviness. Inside the house, the air felt lighter, as though something long overdue had finally shifted into place. I walked back to the kitchen, touched the back of the chair where my husband used to sit, and let a soft breath leave my chest. He had always trusted I would know what to do when the time came. And I had. I closed the envelope one last time and placed it gently in the top drawer, a symbol not of the battle but of the love that came before it. My story didn't end at that dinner table, and it didn't end in a lawyer's office. It ended here, in my own home, with my voice finally steady again. I wasn't the burden. I never had been, and now everyone knew it.